Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm Anna Spooner from the tastings team at the Wine Society. And for those of you I haven't met before, hello. And the wonderful Mahesh is behind the scenes, as always, for our Focus On and Sip Side sessions. So hello, Mahesh, and thanks again for all your help this evening. Welcome, members. This is going to be probably, I would say, our most science-based Focus On so far. It feels one of those I don't know, mythical, weird things that you hear about in the world of wine and don't necessarily get to know the finer points. Now, it is an MW topic that comes up a lot, so I won't lie. I've just shown Mahesh pages of research on this. I've really tried to distill it down, and I've also taken on board some of your questions that you kindly sent in advance and busted some of your myths as well. So hopefully we're going to stick to an hour, but please do use the Q&A if you have any other questions. Mahesh can feed them to me and I'll try and weave them in as I go, but if not, there should be a little bit of time at the end. There's also the chat. I've seen that most of you so far have pressed everyone when you've used the chat. Please do. The default for Zoom is that you only send messages to the hosts and the panelists, so only Mahesh and I get to see them. Make sure you hit everyone in the drop down menu so everyone can see where you are and what you're drinking. So without further ado, I'm almost nervous to start. Where do we go from here? We've got a lot to cover, so we're going to do some basic science to start. I'm not a scientist. There will be people far better versed in science than me, but I'm going to give the basic science. It's important to know before we move on. Then I'm going to talk about uses of sulfur, the alternatives as well, the laws and the myths. What I will say is, hello, Zoom user from Saffron Walden. I'm also near Saffron Walden, so that's nice to see. I'm going to encourage you, doesn't matter what's in your glass, we're going to need a large glass of wine. I will do the science and the uses first, and then we'll taste our first pair if you're tasting along with me tonight. But regardless, whatever's in your glass, please, please, please get started. Otherwise, first of all, you'll be thirsty. But second of all, the more you drink, the less embarrassing my bad science will be. So let's do the basics. These are the things we need to understand before we even start throwing words around like sulfur, sulfites. Sulfur on your screen, hopefully on the left, that is elemental sulfur, S on the periodic table. So it's naturally occurring. It's often present in proteins, and we are going to talk about that. But we just need to understand that that's it in its most basic form. Well, basic's the wrong word, but that is pure sulfur. Sulfites with a T. This is the one we're going to focus on today because that's what you see on the back of the bottle. That's what's on the label. Sulfites are forms of sulfur dioxide, SO2. So that's 2 oxygen molecules with your sulfur there. And also its products. There are 3 products that we talk about in wine. I'm going to mention them in a minute. We won't go into them in detail. If you're really interested, I can send you things about what they are, but it's essentially sulfur dioxide, SO2. Think about it like that and you'll get on fine today. Sulfides with a D. This is a reduced sulfur. So you can see from our little molecule diagram, sulfur has made friends with some hydrogen molecules. And this is a reaction that in wine we call redox, also reduction. So if you hear about reduction, bad, severe reduction, in particular can smell like rotten eggs. Light reduction can smell like a lit match, struck match, and different people have different sensitivities to the smell of it. So certainly certain people, I actually quite like a little bit of reduction, but we can all agree that rotten egg and skunk, which is severe reduction, when there is a lot of sulfides present, is a bad thing. And that occurs when bacteria and yeast interact with the sulfur. So that is something we want to avoid. And we're not really going to talk about that today because really we're talking about sulfur in winemaking and sulfites in winemaking, and sulfides is arguably a fault. So goodbye. We're all agreed. Eggy wine, not so good. So second bit of science, but I put some pictures in of animals, so hopefully you won't mind. Sulfites i.e. that middle section we were talking about, the SO2, they occur in two basic different states in wine. One is free and one is bound. And it's really important to know the difference. Free sulfur, I like to think of it as the hunting sulfur. So it's my wildcat, it's my snow leopard. It's active. It's the type of SO2 that will find a bacteria and go and get it. So free sulfur dioxide is what's really important and often measured in the wine. I mentioned earlier there are 3 different types. You don't technically need to know about bisulfites or sulfite SO3 with the equal sign. But what you do need to know more about those is the leather sulfur. So SO2 is the absolute dream of the the tiger world, or whatever you want it, the snow leopard, whatever analogy you want to use. That's the real hunter. So we're looking for molecular sulfur, and that is above all else the super duper one. But free sulfur in general is that thing that is more active. Molecular sulfur just happens to be able to be more active against lots of different things like bacteria, oxygen, etc., whereas the other 2 have limitations. Now, sulfur dioxide or bound sulfites are something completely different. So ones that have already attached themselves to something, and it's not another sulfur. So we're not talking about the molecules getting together here. So we're not talking about two cats. We're talking about a cat and something else. So here, this little cat is not going to hunt for anything. It has bound to something like a sugar or an acetaldehyde or a phenolic compound in your wine. Because of that, no hunting going on. It's not going out to find any faults. It's not doing a job, really. It's just having a little relax with a Yorkie. So well, I hope you don't mind those. I just thought I'd make it slightly more. But when we're talking about how much free sulfur, we're talking about how much sulfur is available to do the jobs that we wanted it to do. Bound sulfur is almost useless to us. It all starts life as free sulfur, but once it couples up and gets bound, it becomes slightly useless to us. And it's really, really important to get the distinction. You can have a wine that's got really high sulfur content in bound sulfur, but once that sulfur is bound, it's not reactive, it's happy, it's having a snooze. It's that free sulfur that we're really talking about. So what are the uses? There's a lot of anti here, and varying degrees. Sulfur dioxide or SO2 or sulfites, whichever way you want to call them, have varying degrees of effectivity on these things. But I can never say this word, antioxidasic. It sounds like I'm singing when I say antioxidasic. In really plain terms, it's a little bit like stunting the activity of certain enzymes. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you a bit more in practical terms about these uses in the winery. But antioxidasic is to do with the enzymes. So if you just remember that. Antimicrobial kindly does what it says on the tin. So when you have microbes in the wine, more often than not, this might be a yeast that you don't want to use. I'll go into that in a second, but there are other microbes too that create spoilage. So antimicrobial is almost like a bit of one of the health checks, should we say. Antioxidant again does what it says on the tin. Yay! So this stops the wine from oxidizing, and in fact SO2 is what is often put in, or part of the blend, I should say. For example, if you've ever wondered why on earth when I buy a fruit salad are my apples not green, not browned, why haven't they oxidized? You know, you get those lovely fruit salads that have a green skinned apple that's got the whitest flesh in the middle, but it's been cut and sat on your shelf in Sainsbury's for days. That's because it's including an antioxidant gas such as sulfur, and that is exactly what's happening in the wine. We don't want our wines to go brown, we don't want them to spoil, we don't want them to oxidize, so it acts as an antioxidant. And then last but not least, again, kindly does what it says on the tin, an antibacterial, so to stop the growth of bacteria and to stop wines going bad through bacterial spoilage. So really fundamentally, what you'll notice is anti. A lot of these things are, well, it's all preventative. Sulfur dioxide is used as a preventative solution in the wine industry. So where can we use it? and why. Sulfur is used, sulfur dioxide, I should say, has been used in winemaking since Roman times. And the Romans were actually the people who first discovered that burning a candle of sulfur inside a barrel and releasing the SO2 that's produced, or at least producing the SO2, I should say, actually stopped your wine smelling like vinegar. So that process that they discovered but couldn't explain is still a process that's very much practiced today, about in a second. But Romans were doing this. This isn't something new. This isn't something high-tech or modern. We've just refined how we use it. Now, arguably, in the 1990s, we went a bit wild and we decided we wanted to use it on everything. There's definitely a pullback now. I'm going to go into the laws in a minute, but they are changing all the time. They're getting less and less and less in terms of restrictions, because there are alternatives and there are other measures. But I'm going to tell you about a few of the ways that we can use sulfur, the element, and sulfur dioxide in winemaking. So in the top, this is a picture of a vineyard in Chablis being sprayed with sulfur, the element. Not sulfur dioxide, all the rest is sulfur dioxide. Sulfur, the element, can be used as a contact product. So what that means is it actually lands on the grapes and it's doing a job contacting the grapes. It's sprayed on vines to prevent rot at times, but specifically powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is a huge problem. Now, there are issues. I said I wasn't going to mention it, but I'm going to mention it quickly. There are issues if you spray too late. So if you notice the rot coming and you think, oh golly gosh, or the powdery mildew, more specifically, it's quite, you can see it. If you see that coming, I'll just take this down for a moment whilst I explain. If you see that rot coming and you say, hey, heck, I need to get some sulfur on that to stop it. It might already be too late for starters. There's so much evidence to show that you need to almost put the sulfur on before you can see the issue. But the other thing is that sometimes what happens is when you then start fermenting those grapes, if there's any residual sulfur left on those grapes, that can actually cause what we were talking about earlier, which is the sulfide. So that's the rotten egg smell. So a lot of people are very scared about using sulfur because they don't necessarily know their harvest dates. And you can't time it perfectly. So a lot of people don't actually do this program or this process for fear of creating sulfides, that nasty rotten egg smell. And that's a chemical reaction that happens during fermentation to create that third kind of sulfur that we were discussing. So important to know that, I say. So let's go on to the next ones. Now, I've witnessed this and it was fascinating. If you have moldy grapes coming into the winery, and this is sort of a picture that's in between these, I guess. If you have some mold on your grapes coming into the winery, now you need to make a profit, you need to make your wine. You're not going to chuck away absolutely every grape. You'll chuck away the worst mold, but you are going to have to make wine with what you've got. And unfortunately, if you've had a really bad rain, you've had fog, you've had stickiness, you haven't had the winds to blow through properly, or if the mold's got caught in between the grapes, the bunches, and you can't even really see it, but it's there. You might, that mold, has, it's got I said I was going to mention an enzyme. It's the only one I'm going to mention. It's a polyphenol oxidase enzyme, and it's called lacase. Don't worry, you don't need to remember that. But this, you need to treat that. Otherwise, you're going to have all sorts of problems with your fermentation. So what you might do at that point when you're crushing, for example, your red fruit, is you might add some sulfur dioxide in the form of probably a liquid, which is very common. So you'll add a liquid solution and you might pour it in with the crusher with the grapes. Now, at that point, you're adding that free sulfur, and it's going to work to sort out those enzymes, and it's going to start binding with certain things. So you're not going to be left with the amount of free sulfur. Because you can add SO2 at every point in winemaking, really, or nearly, you have to be really careful with your calculations. So when you're adding it, you need to have some really good predictions about what's going to end up as your total free sulfur at the end, because that's what's measured by law, and we'll go into that. But you might need it. You might know that you need it at that point, and there is nothing else you can do. Straight in with the sulfur dioxide off the bat. So when else might we use it? We might need to, when we're making our fermentation, we might have some non-Saccharomyces yeast that we want to get rid of. So a yeast that won't help our alcoholic fermentation. So we might want to get rid of those. We're really lucky. The gods shone down on us. The correct yeast for fermentations are the least affected by SO2. So you can actually put in SO2 and kill all the other yeasts, and Saccharomyces will still generally survive. So no one knows why, but luckily it works. You might also want to, you're aging your wine, say, maybe not even in barrel, but let's say you're aging your wine in a vat. And you can age your wine in the vat, but you notice there's been some microbial changes. So one thing you might notice is if you put that free sulfur in at the beginning, you might notice suddenly lots and lots of sulfur is being bound up. And you think, why is my free sulfur reducing so much? It might be because it is genuinely being bound to those microbes. And you might go, hold the phone, I need to go and have a look at this. There is some microbial spoilage going on in my wine. So you might need to do that. You might need to add some sulfur at bottling, and this is really common. Sulfur dioxide is great, as we said, as a antioxidant. So no oxygen spoilage and also microbial spoilage. So you might pump a little bit of SO2 into the top when you're bottling, probably a gas in that case. And then, I haven't told you about what I will quickly mention the way you might add sulfur to a microbial spoiling vat, for example. If you've got a bad fermentation or if you've got some spoilage, you can add something called potassium metabisulfate. And it is obviously with potassium, which then drops out after the chemical reaction. And it's sort of like a powder, beige yellowy powder, and you would take some wine, you'd mix it in and dissolve it, and then you would add that dissolved solution back into the vat. And that's actually quite a safe, relatively safe method, because it's very controlled. You can measure things by the gram compared to by the liter of the vat, so you've got full kind of full control over how much you're putting in that case. And then last but not least, and I saw this last week, I was lucky enough to go to Rioja, and in Muga they still do the traditional way of cleaning their barrels, which is to take a piece of bright yellow sulfur. They're not bright yellow actually anymore, which is odd because sulfur is, on a stick, and they set fire to it and they put it in the barrel, and then they let the barrel, the vapors, it's not vapor, it's SO2, they let the SO2 fill the barrel, and it gets in all the nooks and crannies. And it cleans out the barrel as an antioxidant, as an antibacterial and an antimicrobial as well. So those are the uses. It's pretty much the only thing that can be used at every stage in winemaking, or nearly every stage, like I mentioned. It's really important. So we are going to, obviously, we're doing this almost a bit backwards, but for reasons I kind of want to explain. I wanted us to try the without sulfite wine first, and we're going to compare it to the wine with sulfites. And then we're going to finally talk about the later wine in a moment. So we'll just be trying the first two wines side by side now. The reason we're going to do that is I've obviously just told you why you need sulfur, and we're going to try a wine that has not added any sulfur. And I use added quite definitely, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But I've already had a question from Colin. Should a zero sulfur wine taste different in any way? Nothing my palate can detect on this wine. Colin, it's like you read my mind. That's the plan. So I wanted you to taste both wines. I wanted you to taste them side by side if you can, and see if you can detect anything. But I will tell you a little bit about how they're made, and how you have to make this wine differently if you're going to avoid sulfur. So I'll quickly show you this and then I'll talk about it, but you'll see that it's Grenache and Syrah grown at 400 meters. You will see that it's 14% on here. It's actually 14.5. So I do need to tell the web team about that. Yeah, it's 14.5. So apologies, that's incorrect. You will see, and I'm just picking out things to notice. You will see that the price is £15.50. And you will see that it's drink now to 2023. Okay, with no oak influence. So that is Domaine Jomes, Côte de Rhône, which I don't know why it's a Côte de Rhône. Well, it's, again, I think we've got a whoopsie on the website. It's actually a Van Sobe. So the reason I picked them is they're both Van Soap. Unless there's some law that they've missed, should we say. This is definitely a Van Soap wine, so ignore the Côte de Rhône. They are both cru Rhône wines of the northernmost cru in the southern Rhône. So I pointed out a few of those things. Keep those in mind, what I mentioned. So I mentioned it was more expensive. The winery are under no illusion that this should not be more expensive. They admit it is much harder to produce this wine. So they have to tend all of their vines organically because they are certified. So everything's tended organically. But this wine they've had to harvest by hand. Why? I've just mentioned the fruit has to be really perfect. Well, what I've actually said is if you have imperfect fruit, you can help that with sulfur. They're not using their sulfur dioxide, so they have to make sure the fruit is perfect. They have 2 sortings in order to make sure the quality is good and that there's no rot. They have to manage the pH. I'm not going to go into this too much, although the chemists in the team might be upset, but they have to manage the pH of the wine very carefully, i.e. acid and alkaline scale. That is because lower pH wines actually require less sulfur. It's to do with how much free sulfur is active. So the lower the pH, i.e. the more acidic on the scale, not total acid, but on acid scale, the lower the pH, the better the free sulfur is at staying free and moving around and doing its job. So just bear that in mind. They have to manage the pH of the wine really carefully. They have to keep everything sparkling clean. So they can't allow for one not quite clean barrel. They can't allow for a little bit of dirt in a pump or a microbe here or there. You can't, there's no sort of loose way of doing it if you want to produce top quality wine. Of course, if you don't care and you want to add no sulfites and just let the microbes in, that's different. But if you're producing wine that needs to be shipped and sold at the Wine Society at a top quality, you need to keep everything spotless. I was about to say sparkling, then I said spotless. So it's £15 more expensive. That's something to watch. I think it's not £15 more expensive. It's just under £5 more expensive, but it's £15.50. I think worth it for the amount of quality time that goes into it. So how is it different? Right. Well, 20 meters more altitude on the second wine. We are going to taste them in a second, don't worry. I told you I'd chat for a little bit. 20 meters more altitude. Okay, fine. We're not going to hold them to that. Same amount of alcohol, no oak influence, but this wine has been in oak barrels partially for some time. So I will say oxygen has got into here. You may recall oxygen is not a friend of a wine that can't have sulfur dioxide. It can be a bit of a challenge because if your wine starts to oxidize, you haven't got anything in your toolkit to help that. So this wine has seen some barrel aging, although not large amounts to influence it, just supplements the fruit and builds a bit of tannin. The same varieties though here, so Grenache and Syrah. So we've picked 2 wines that are, I think, good comparisons. And then last but not least, the main thing to notice for me is the drink date. Now, 2023 versus 2028. We've put enough sulfur dioxide in here to act as a preservative, as an antioxidant, antibacterial, antimicrobial. That means that generally the wines can live a bit longer. It's quite hard, it's being done, but it's quite hard to make sulfite-free or incredibly low sulfur. I'll tell you what the kind of legal definitions are in a minute, but it's quite hard to make, I said sulfite-free, I promised I wouldn't do that. It's hard to make low sulfite or no added sulfite wines that age for a long time. It can be done, but it's incredibly hard. So let's have a taste if you're tasting along with me, and hopefully you're already tasting. I can see some of you have already got your glasses full. Let's have a quick go. I wanted to do the Natura first. The reason I wanted to do that is, well, it's twofold. Initially, I wanted to do it first because I thought we had 2018 of both vintages. I wish we sort of did, and then part of me thinks actually it's great we don't. Originally when I did it, I thought we were on the 2018 of this wine. We're not, which actually means that it's kind of already on its progression, and it's progressing much, much faster. And so it does make the comparison maybe more interesting. Not quite a fair game, but more interesting. So for me, black fruits, yeah, in abundance. The Jaume family, who make both these wines, specialize in high altitude Syrah in the Rhone. They actually are kind of the kings of Syrah, certainly in my opinion. So we are getting quite a decent dollop of Syrah in this compared to some of the other crus of the Rhone. It's got licorice for me. It was much more so when I first opened it, but really woody and earthy. I don't know whether anyone's tasting along and agrees. So all of those kind of more farmy, but not farmy aromas, definitely a bit more developed. And before I taste it, I'm going to smell the other wine. So when I smelled this earlier, it was much more fruit forward. Now, yeah, for me, it's less herbal. So it's much more like candied fruit. Again, shout if you're tasting along and you think I'm talking nonsense. I don't know. This for me tastes a bit like blackcurrant fruit pasta. Smells, sorry, like blackcurrant fruit pastels, but with a touch of licorice, and it's got that licorice root and that gorgeous smell that you'd hope for in a Van Sober as well. But definitely less earthy and definitely less herbal. If the herbs are in there, they're bordering on a kind of eucalypt. I know they're not that, but it's bordering on that compared to the actually this is more garrigue, so French. They're beautiful. It's almost what's the combination? It's like a combination between tarragon and thyme for me, the garrigue, whereas this is a much more earthy, smoky herbal flavor, or aroma I should say. So have a quick taste and then we will move on. Whilst you're tasting as well, it's worth noting this is tiny production, and the reason is it's so hard to make. So 3,800 bottles are produced. The winery overall, I think, produces about 60,000 a year. So it's a really small proportion of their production. And they actually number the bottles. So I've got 2,756, should you wish to know. So let's have a quick taste. On the palate, very fruit forward compared to the nose for me. Really, really fresh. Surprisingly fresh given that it's 2017, so they've got that acidity spot on. It's still got that slightly savory meaty note, so it is progressing into that stage quite quickly for a wine of this age, but in a really lovely way. Now, I haven't tasted this at 1 year old or 2 years old. My suspicion is, had we tasted the 18 vintage or even the 19, and it's actually not released yet, I don't think, but yes, actually it is, I think. Had we tasted that, a lot of low sulfite wines tend to be quite fruit forward early on. Not always, you can make all sorts of styles, but they do tend to be quite fruity early on because you're not oak aging and you're not doing too much tannin extraction in the same way, and you're not necessarily using your your funkier yeasts, should we say, because you need to preserve it and protect it. Now, the lovely thing about this is you can still taste that really protected fruit, but it's got a lot of development as well. So let's go for the second wine, the wine with sulfites. And I wish I could tell you the number. I did email lovely Marie at Jaume and ask if you are so interested. Let me know, and I once I get the number, I will forward it on. I mean, it's not a million miles apart. There's more black pepper spice for me in that. There is that more herbal. There is that sort of sweeter fruit. It's less developed. We're talking 2 different years, so I don't want to be too cruel about the development stages, but slightly different. And I would probably say a bit less expressive. I would say the Vinea Natura, it has a bit more going on. Be that a little bit of that earthiness and that developed note. But this is actually the one with sulfites is slightly lighter. So something to note. Paul's just asked a question in the Q&A that I keep meaning to address, and I've been avoiding it. So I was going to wait till the law question, but I think it's important to address it now. I have an issue with this labeling term, sans sulfite, without sulfites. This is not possible. Sulfites are a byproduct of fermentation. So in order to make wine, you will have naturally occurring sulfites. Obviously, there are a couple of terms in other countries. You can have no added sulfites, but sans sulfites is really tricky language. I will go onto it a bit more later. It's not possible. they occur naturally. Your yeast, one of the things that's produced in the fermentation are sulfites. So it can't be avoided. Obviously, it's quite hard to measure those ones, and you haven't added them, and that's very different. And when I go on to labeling laws, I will explain that. And it's such a low percentage that they are produced that it's almost negligible. But it's frustrating because I think it makes the understanding about what sulfites are challenging. Sulfites do occur in the natural world, but they also occur in winemaking. So to say a wine is without sulfites, I think is misleading personally, but it is the French terminology. And we've got to live with it. So thank you, Paul, for flagging that. Yes, sans sulfites or without sulfites, personally, I find incredibly misleading. So let's quickly go and talk about what the Jaumes would have done or would have, and what other I was about to say low or no sulfites. I was about to literally do the thing I just told you is not possible. Those who don't want to add any sulfites or minimal sulfites to their wine, what other things can they do? Clean, clean, clean. I'm not going to focus on these alternatives too much, and try and probably be a bit more fun about them, because later in the year I have actually already booked in a session on controversially termed natural wines. So we're not going to go into loads and loads of bits here, but I will just give you a sort of few examples or a few thoughts. I mentioned I was in Rioja last week. I was shown a barrel cleaning machine at Cuney, which uses a product called ozone, which I'm not sure I fully understood it, and I need to go back. May have been a language barrier, but my understanding is there's an iodized water. Either way, I asked why, and they said they didn't want any residual sulfur dioxide in their barrels because they don't want to use that system anymore, the traditional system Muga were using. They want their wine to be as clean as possible, and a lot of wineries are coming up with alternative solutions. So you have to spend a lot of money for a machine like that one at Cuney. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but you do have to make everything very clean. One alternative that's becoming increasingly popular is filtering your wines a bit more aggressively. Now, if you consider that sulfur is the cat hunting for those microbes or that yeast, bacteria is a bit hard. Yeah, bacteria. Instead of the hunter being there, why not remove the problem? And filtering does do that to a certain extent. There's a popular filter called a tangential filter, which is taking out a lot of the things that could make the wine go bad. Now, some people say that strips the wine of some flavors, so the jury is a bit out on that, but certainly a lot of the good low sulfur wines would filter their wines in order to remove a potential future risk, which is one way around the problem. Nitrogen is an alternative to SO2 in a few ways. So you can use a bit of nitrogen at bottling, so that would help in that respect. But you can also actually sparge nitrogen. You can use oxygen to sparge. Use nitrogen to sparge oxygen out of your wine. So you actually remove or you reduce the oxidative risk. Or there's something very controversial, which is great fun, and Google it if you've never seen it before, but you can actually oxidize white wine on purpose, and you turn it the color of coffee, and then it sort of comes 360 and turns back into normal wine again. We haven't got time to talk about that, but it is an incredible thing to do. So why would you walk the tightrope of doing all of this? Why would you not just use sulfur dioxide and make clean, safe, easy to drink wine that you can ship around the world and not have to worry is going to re-ferment in the bottle halfway to Europe or whatever it might be? So there's a few reasons, and there's reasons that winemakers are reducing sulfur dioxide, and then there's reasons that people think winemakers are reducing sulfur dioxide. So let's go with some real ones, shall we? And then I'll bust some myths at the end. So some people believe it's a greater expression of the terroir, and there have certainly been studies done, and increasingly more studies on what that means. Is there really, can you really taste, or rather, are there tastes that are lacking because sulfur dioxide has been used. One study I've read about is about Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough, certainly from New Zealand, I think from Marlborough, and those which had higher levels of SO2, so have had more sulfur dioxide use, had that kind of classic but pretty generic passion fruit, that kind of character, whereas the ones with the lower levels of SO2 had a lot more mineral and citrus components coming up. And there is quite a lot of evidence that SO2 plays around with the thiols and aroma compounds in wine and can mute some and allow others to shine, as it were. So I guess if you're calling that terroir, if that's the grape, you know, if you want an expression of the grape that you think is of its most natural self, then sure, perhaps you want to reduce your SO2. Something I couldn't spot in these, and I wondered whether we would, but certainly in the bottles I've got, tell me different if you have, is sulfur dioxide also bleaches the color out of wines. Maybe not a major problem, but actually a lot of people do judge wine on color. So for bigger brands, that you know, where people might be looking at the color of it and saying, oh, that's going to be too dark and rich for me, SO2 might be a choice to bleach the color. Or actually maybe you want a darker color, maybe it's a Malbec from Cahors and you want to keep it lovely and dark. And mostly I would say that there's plenty of evidence to say that sulfur affects the mouthfeel of the wine. And I think even in the most basic understanding, if you've got sulfur compounds binding with sulfur dioxide, sorry, I should say, binding with other compounds and creating, you know, if it's binding with acetaldehydes and things, inevitably kind of in my brain, I'm thinking, well, of course it's going to change the mouthfeel. There are chemical reactions going on in the wine. Why would it not? Obviously, some say those are for better, there's arguments for worse, but certainly if you're the winemaker and you want to make a proactive choice, then go for it. Ultimately, it's the winemaker's choice on all of this, but the main thing I'd say about low sulfur or no added sulfur wines is if the quality is not matching up, then is it really worth it in the end? So if the winemaker can make great quality wine, such as this Vinea Natura by the Jaime family, brilliant. But if they're not making quality wine and they're just selling wine on the premise of it being low sulfur, I have a bit of an issue with that. So the law, right, I'm going to zoom through these. If you want to know more about this, there's plenty of evidence online. Legal maximums below are for EU, and they are for not organic or biodynamic wines. So they are for conventionally farmed wines. Australia's a bit funny. They are a little bit more lax and they have basically a below and above threshold, but this is a pretty standard European Union measurement. So red wine is 150 parts per million, teeny amount. As we discussed, one of the reasons for adding SO2 is to stabilize your wine. Now, red wines already have tannins, so it's already got a good stabilizer in there. So that's why red wine actually has the lowest maximum limit legally allowed of sulfur dioxide. Then they're a little bit more lenient with white and rosé wines. Now, why? Well, it's not made like red wines. The skins aren't left in contact. Those natural antioxidants haven't been absorbed into the wine, not leached out of those skins. So it needs some more to make it safe. Now, sweet wine, and this is why I've got this sweet wine to show you. You are allowed to put a lot more in sweet wine, and here is why. Well, it's nearly 3 times the amount. But if you consider what I said way back in the beginning with our little cats, our little puss cat and our roaming mountain lion, we've already said when you add your free sulfur, if it binds, it becomes redundant. Now, one of the things that it can bind to is sugar. So with sweet wines, you need to add more parts per million in order to make sure that your free levels are kept topped up into a safe level of free. I hope that makes sense. It's quite a complicated way to describe it, but imagine that you've made too many kittens and you're losing your mountain cats, so you need to keep adding more to get those mountain cats going. They're no longer hunting to solve your problems. Now, sulfur dioxide is also microbial. So if you've got any stray yeasts, those will also eat the sugar, and they will re-ferment in the bottle. So not only do you have the fact that the sugars are being bound to the sulfur, you've also got the problem that if you've got any yeast left in there at all, you're going to start to get a fizzy sweet wine. So you actually need quite a decent amount of sulfur to keep your sweet wines safe, flat, not dodgy. Organic reds are lower. So I've just given you an example. I'm sorry, organic and biodynamic both have lower thresholds in the EU. So reds, for example, no longer 150. For organic, they go down to 100. And for Demeter regulated biodynamic, go down to 70. Organic wine in the US, this is interesting, can have no SO2 added at all. Obviously, the grapes also have to be organic, and there will be some SO2 created in the process of fermentation, but they can have no SO2 added. And that is why in the US, the threshold they have for contained sulfites is 10 parts per million. So much, much less. And that's because they're basically not adding SO2 to those organic wines. Olaf's asked what biodynamic is. We have a webinar coming up on biodynamics. So imagine it like organics plus the moon and all the stars and loads of crazy stuff. And Olaf, you'll have to come to the biodynamics webinar. I think it might be on the website already, but if it's not, we've got three great producers coming. It should be on by the end of the week. Just wanted to leave you with this on the law before we taste this lovely sweet wine with enough sulfur to keep it sound. The food.gov.uk actually says we do not believe that any wine can be correctly described as sulfite-free. So I mentioned it earlier. I think was it Patrick who asked the question. Apologies if that wasn't correct, but this is the point. It's very hard to say something is sulfite-free, a wine. So let's quickly have a taste of this one. I just wanted to include it to show you that sulfur is not the devil before we go into busting some myths. Sulfur is what keeps this wine delicious, and it is one of my favorite sweet wines. It's my go-to. It's the one I bring out at dinner parties. But particularly what I think is interesting is that late harvest sweet wines are especially in need of they have the rots, you know, they've got Botrytis cinerea. Now, Botrytis cinerea, noble rot that produces this style of wine that is akin to Sauternes, but this is actually from a slightly cheaper appellation, Montbazillac. Those rots, you want to manage the rot levels. You don't want the bad rot to come in. So actually, Montbazillacs, Sauternes, Tokais, a lot of the sweet wines made with an element of Botrytis, Trockenbeer and Auslese from Germany, those have actually pretty high levels of sulfur. And to this day, I've only ever smelt sulfur on one wine, and it was a German sweet Riesling, and I could smell it. I could physically smell the sulfur, and it's very hard to know what pure sulfur smells like. And I only know it from having worked in wineries because, yeah, it's not a common smell. So have a little taste, but if you want to enjoy it before I go on to busting a couple of myths, essentially for me, this is kind of gorgeous, some tropical fruits, some melon, a bit of white flowers, lemon, lime, lemon curd, maybe that kind of extra sweet lemon, preserved, you know, the lovely ones that you put on the top of the cakes. Candied lemons, that's what I mean. It's got that lovely pineapple thing that you get from botrytized wines. They often have pineapple, mango, those sorts of things. So have a little taste and I will bust some myths. Lovely, luscious wine, thick, rich, again, plenty of sugar packed into there. What's keeping the sugar from keeping it safe? Well, they've probably filtered it to get the yeast out as well, but not necessarily. They've probably got a bit of SO2 in there, keeps it fresh. We can't drink these styles of wine now, given the distance they have to be transported. It'd be very different if they're producing wine and we were drinking it, you know, straight off the bat. But these wines have to be preserved. They have to be shipped. They have to be held in warehouses. So yeah, we just couldn't drink that style of wine very easily without sulfur dioxide. So let's bust some myths. I've just had one question that I'm going to address now because it wasn't on my myth busts. But I will just quickly mention it before we go into the fun myths busts. Peter Cousins has asked, does sulfur kill Brettanomyces? Good question. And I have had two very contradictory answers to that question. Some people say that Brettanomyces is not affected at all by sulfur dioxide. Some people say that if you put it in early, right at the beginning, then you prevent Brettanomyces from growing. Brettanomyces, for anyone that doesn't know, is a kind of stable yard, horsey smelling effect that you get from a certain yeast. But Peter, the answer is that I've been given two opposite answers to that question. So I think the jury might be out, and I think they're still doing a bit of work. So first question, is sulfur bad for me? No. World Health Organization states, I'm just going to remind myself, sorry. Right, the maximum daily intake of sulfur dioxide you should have is 0.7 milligrams per kilo of your body weight. So that for a grown man, that would be about one bottle of dry red wine. Now that's 60 parts per million, let's say, because most red wine is nowhere near 150. That's the maximum EU limit. Most is 50 to 70. So let's say you're having your 60 parts per million dry red wine. That is going to push you to your maximum limit of sulfur dioxide sulfur dioxide per day. You've already gone way over your alcohol allowance anyway. So the alcohol is going to get you drinking 6 units before the sulfur does. Secondly, sulfite-free wine better for me? I do not like that language. I explained to you earlier, sulfite-free is a misnomer, as we saw earlier. No wine is completely free of sulfur. Lower sulfite wines, there isn't any real evidence to suggest they're medically any better for you in any way. I'm going to take this off because we don't need to read that over and over again. There's no evidence to suggest they're medically better for you. But of course, if you are conscious about putting too much sulfur in your body, then wines with lower sulfur would be better for you from your choice point of view. And we've already proven that they exist in a really, really great quality level. But also remember, we're talking about free sulfur. That's what we're talking about here. Free sulfur is what you have the reaction with. Bound sulfur won't create a reaction. So you must remember that. And then this is the juicy one. Is sulfur giving me my hangovers or my headache? No, it's not. Almost everyone I speak to that says they get headaches from wine, it's red wine. Now, we've just shown that red wine has the lowest legal limit. The threshold for what you're allowed to put free parts per million sulfur in red wine is the lowest. We also know that it's got its own antioxidant properties and it's got tannins, etc., that preserve it longer. So red wine, least likely to be a sulfur problem. Yes, some people do have a sulfur sensitivity. Now, it's less than 1% of the population, and it's usually very, very asthmatic individuals. In rare cases, you can have a low production or no production of a certain enzyme that breaks down SO2, but actually you're more likely to be severely asthmatic. The two go hand in hand. That is why there is a legal requirement on the label that says contains sulfites. So here we go, contains sulfites on the label, probably can't quite see. That's why the legal requirement exists, because it is an allergen, but it is an allergen for a very, very small amount of population. That contains sulfites, I think, is what has done so much damage to the industry in terms of people being worried about sulfites. Whereas actually, yes, we don't want to overuse them, but they are important. To give you some perspective, there are more sulfites in dried fruit than there are in wine. So between 2,000 parts per million in dried fruit. Bearing in mind, I've just told you that a bottle of red wine is about 60. Yeah, you're probably not going to eat as many dried apricots as a whole bottle of wine, but you probably shouldn't drink the whole bottle. Well, you wouldn't mind, but dried fruit, dried apricots, dried figs, particularly bad, actually. Those are a real shame. I love those at Christmas, but anyway, they don't make me ill, so hey ho. Canned soup is about 230 parts per million. Dried meats, I've eaten a lot of Parma ham today. I am probably over my limit. How did it stay so fresh? Sulfur dioxide. Bagged lettuce, honestly, I could go on. If you get any symptoms consuming any of those things, then you have a sulfite sensitivity. It can be a range of things. It can be particularly throat. It can be itchy skin, often things that are associated with the asthmatic group of reactions. So you might have a sulfur sensitivity. But if you don't, and you're getting headaches or you're getting bad hangovers from certain wines, particularly red wines, what is causing the hangover? I said I was going to have a quick go at this. It's hard because there is no definitive answer. If there were a definitive answer, then, well, if there were a definitive answer, somebody would be making an awful lot of money from it. So it's probably a mixture. In general, well, some people, red wine seems to be the problem, basically. So they've done a lot of research into what is it about red wine, because red wine tends to be the thing that either gives people headaches or brings them out in a hot flash, and they're two different symptoms. Current thinking is that it's probably, and there was an MW paper written on this last year or the year before. If it's open public source, I will send it around. Current thinking is it's an intolerance to, or an allergic reaction potentially to, something called a biogenic aneme, or aneme, depending if you're American. One of those is histamine. So you may be familiar with that word. So that is a type of biogenic aneme. Histamines are more commonly found in wines that have undergone malolactic fermentation. You don't really need to know about that if you don't know what it is, but put it like this: all red wines go through that process. It's a secondary reaction rather than a fermentation. Some white wines do as well. If you get that creamy white wine flavor rather than a tartar flavor, may have gone through malolactic fermentation. So that has a higher proportion, between 20 to 200% more likely to have the biogenic aneme than their white counterparts. So that is something that people are thinking now might be a big deal. And I actually know more than one buyer at the Wine Society that takes an antihistamine tablet before a big day of red wine tastings, as they suspect they might have a histamine or a biogenic amine sensitivity or a reaction. There are other biogenic amines. Oh, sorry, a fly. So there's one called tyrines, and I'm sorry, I don't actually know how to pronounce that. But that's currently being studied. It's another type of biogenic amine that isn't histamine, and some people are deficient in an enzyme that can break that down as well. So yeah, so that's another potential factor. Jury is out, but the research is looking like it's heading most likely that way. But there is another big one for me, which is something that's less on the radar now, but was certainly quite popular a while ago to talk about, and that's acetaldehyde. So acetaldehyde is something called a cogener, i.e. it's a byproduct of the alcoholic fermentation. Now, it's actually when ethanol oxidizes, so it's the oxidation of ethanol. It's deemed that it could be, Caroline Gilby wrote us a great piece on the website about this, up to 10 to 30 times more toxic than actual ethanol itself, and might be what causes the headaches. Now, of all the wines, oak-aged red wines are more likely to have this compound in them. So potentially oak-aged red wines might be the issue. I have a friend who gets bad headaches from red wines, and I have basically given her a few experiments, and one of them is oak aging, and to see whether she could differentiate whether she's getting more or less headaches from an oak-aged red wine or a wine that's higher in acetaldehyde. But finally, don't want to sound like a bore, but dehydration. Dehydration is known to trigger all sorts of things, and drinking in moderation obviously is going to help with your headaches or your hangovers. Dehydration, there's all sorts of antidiuretic things that go on with how we process alcohol, and it really does make a difference. But quite frankly, there are obviously other things going on as well. So the only real answer that we have at the moment is moderation, and I know that for Wine Society members, that might not be the answer. So we got 5 more minutes. I actually answered a few questions as I went along, so I hope that's all right with everyone. And I had a few that came in advance, so thank you for sending those. It makes it quite easy for me to combine them into my session. Quick question from a member: is the zero sulfite worth the premium? I would say yes, and I wouldn't say that it's always the case. You know, I've had plenty of lower sulfites, or French sans sulfite wines, or I've had plenty countries of low sulfite wines where the labeling, they're tapping into a market that's very concerned about sulfites, and therefore the quality is forgiven for not being so good, and it's a way to sort of peddle less good wine. I think in this case that is not the case. This is a really good quality wine. For me, it was actually more complex than the altitude. Different drinking occasion, and I would like to see tomorrow whether I agree, because that's the other thing. Will this wine last till tomorrow? maybe not. It might not be as good tomorrow. So I'll let you know. Maybe I'll send my follow-up email a bit later and I'll do a quick tasting in the morning. But generally, don't assume that a lower sulfite wine will be better. Don't assume that a lower sulfite will be worse. Each wine has to be taken on its own merit, but that one is definitely worth the premium for me. Great question from Phil. What is the threshold of SO2 that can be tasted? And does SO2 come off if the bottle glass is open in the air? So I'll answer the second part first. Free SO2 does. So if it hasn't bound, obviously you put in the required limit that you think, you'll do a calculation. My wine is traveling X distance for, 6 weeks in a container, and it needs to be in fresh condition when it arrives on the shelves in England from New Zealand. So yes, you will put some SO2 in the top of that bottle if you want to preserve it. When you open it, if it hasn't bound, if it hasn't found anything, you're not ingesting it. It goes into the atmosphere. It goes into the air. That's fine. So that's not really a problem. It has started mingling in the wine, but yeah, like you said, once you've got it in the glass and stuff, you're not glugging down loads of extra SO2. It's not the case. Now, the threshold that SO2 can be tasted, it's going to really annoy me that I can't remember the number. It's quite high. I want to say it's 1,000 parts per million. Hold the phone on that one. It might be 600. It's really high. But that's the threshold of SO2. It's tricky because it's free SO2 that you're tasting, not bound. And I was probably tasting, when I mentioned about tasting the German bottle, I just opened it and I could smell it in my first pour of the glass and not the second. So it probably was that SO2 that was escaping, which would be very different in concentration. So yeah, I'll get back to you on that because I actually do know the answer, but I can't remember it. My brain has gone. Paul, I've answered about the no added sulfur question and how that's a bit of a misnomer. And you have asked, are we going to get some numbers relating to the sulfite content of these wines? As I mentioned earlier, I have asked the Jomes if I can get the free sulfites content of Van Soap, which I will try and get to you if I can. Obviously, this is sans sulfites. It will be negligible, less than 10 grams, as we discussed. That's what makes it sans sulfite in the US, and that's also kind of the respected idea. And then the Monbazillac, they are a tiny, teeny tiny producer. I can ask them. I would like to know myself, but they are a little diddly producer, and they might not get back to me particularly quickly. I don't think they'll sort of drop an email and get back, but I will ask for you. Paul's also asked, low sulfite is sometimes associated with natural wines. It is, and again, that for me is a bit of a challenge. You don't have to be low sulfite to be natural. There is no legal definition, although the French have just tried to do something that I will talk about in my natural wine session. But you could be completely natural and still use sulfites in order to preserve your wine. You could be low intervention and then still use sulfites to make sure that your wine gets to market in a good way. So plenty of confusing terminology in that session. It's really a minefield of the natural wine movement. And John and Judith, I do have a mild sulfite sensitivity. With wine, it seems particularly triggered by sulfites added at bottling, i.e. detected on opening. How can I tell if a wine has received bottle added sulfites before opening? It is a really interesting question. It's almost impossible unless you ask the producer themselves. Also, remembering a lot of producers won't actually do the bottling themselves. So if they're contract bottling, they won't have control of that necessarily. So they might not be able to tell you as exact a figure as you would like. My recommendation is, if you find a wine that works for you, maybe obviously stick to it. But if you are interested in trying other wines, most wineries 9 times out of 10 will get back to you with an answer. You can say, do you use sulfites at bottling? Do you use sulfur dioxide at bottling? Sometimes if you go on a winery website, they'll be really open about it. So have a couple of examples of French producers just literally on my desk that I can send you that use nitrogen, for example, and are openly bold about it. And why wouldn't you be? Because of course you're targeting a consumer like yourself, who has got that sensitivity. And of course, the other option is to always go with the sans sulfites, because you can't use this terminology, or no added sulfites is the French one that's very popular. No added sulfite wine means it hasn't been added at all. Sans sulfite's not added at all at any stage, but it is tricky because no sulfite bottling isn't at the moment a labeling term. That doesn't have anything, doesn't really have a shtick. So sadly, it's digging for you. As with a lot of these things, sometimes a bit of research, and you might find producers who are moving towards different bottling techniques. Right. I think that is probably it. I've probably raised more questions than I answered, so I apologise. But I do think that hopefully you now have a bit of a better understanding, even if it's just about labelling terms and the reality behind them. But also, I think, making sure that we're not under any preconception that sulfites are bad for everyone, but equally that we know that there are alternatives and that people are moving towards a lower sulfite general production, and that is being looked after by our regulating bodies. They are definitely working towards lower sulfite wines for our health. But hey, go and eat a packet of Parma ham, some salad, and some dried apricots. And if you're okay, then you can have a glass of wine. Well, I'm going to go enjoy my sans sulfite wine. Thank you so much, members, for joining. Thank you, Mahesh, as always, for helping behind the scenes and moving all the questions over to me. Have a lovely evening all, and cheers.